Art is as important to our modern society as it has ever been. Experimental artists have generally used art as a way of holding a mirror up to society, bucking norms, and challenging their audience. Many artworks that were considered controversial or against the grain are now seen as pieces of art that defined eras, even if they weren't appreciated in their time. Many forms of art have been pushed and innovated by the artists breaking mainstream and commercial molds, stepping away from what's popular, and focusing on the process of the art they're creating. This applies to cinema, especially in our predominantly commercial landscape. Part of the role of art is to challenge the audience. Commercial cinema tends to avoid challenging the audience for many reasons, and contemporary experimental cinema is important to propel cinema forwards as an art form. Commercial cinema has dominated the landscape of film almost since its inception. While the early innovators of film in the late 1800s, like the Lumiere brothers, were simply interested in exploring what the medium could do, by the late 1920s, rapid growth of a few American production companies into lucrative motion picture industry conglomerates who owned all of their own studios, distribution divisions, and theaters had become the overwhelmingly dominating force in the film industry. Michael Apre writes, unlike painting, where the avant-garde rapidly became the mainstream, and where the novelty of new forms now seems a necessary part of its institutional framework, cinema remains a popular commercial art with a mass audience. But despite the domination of commercial cinema over the last 100 years, many filmmakers have remained experimental in their quest to keep cinema exciting and progressive, rather than fulfill the role of a simple commodity. In an article written for the New York Times in November 2019, Martin Scorsese spoke about the Marvel franchise, saying, "When I was in England in early October, I gave an interview to Empire magazine. I was asked a question about Marvel movies. I answered it. I said I've tried to watch a few of them, and they're not for me. That they seem to be closer to theme parks than they are to movies, as I've known and loved them through my life. And that in the end, I don't think they're cinema." While not everyone seemed to agree, the idea that cinema at its core should be about the film and not how much money it will attract is something that resonates with many filmmakers. Filmmaking is a visual art form, and if the only thing that progresses is the technology to produce the films and not the ideas behind them, everything starts to feel the same. Without an experimental fringe of artists exploring different ways to tell stories, the industry would stagnate. A great example of experimental film breaking the conventions of commercial cinema and informing commercial filmmakers for years to come is Richard Linklater's experimental philosophical animated docufiction, Waking Life. This wonderfully bizarre film does everything it can to not be a conventional film. Waking Life follows an unnamed protagonist as he wanders through a series of existential and philosophical conversations. The narrative structure flows in a very unique path, feeling more like a series of never-ending dreams than the start, middle, and end of a story. This is a very intentional move by Linklater, who based the film off a real lucid dream experience he had, saying in a 2001 interview with Pop Masters, "Believe it or not, a movie that's so unreal takes all its cues from personal experience. That really happened to me. It was a really formative lucid dream, like in the movie, that series of false awakenings. It seemed to go on for weeks and got creepy near the end. So the narrative structure is something out of my own experience." The non-conventional narrative structure is reflective of the ideas in the film, dreaming, consciousness, and the idea of life. It's realistic and yet imaginatively constructed, a contradiction. And I thought, oh, that's what your brain's doing, in dreams and in memory. There's no exact anything, it's a reconstruction constantly. So if the film can be perceived on that level, that's the right level to take in the story. Waking Life also has a very idiosyncratic visual style, with the entire film being rotoscoped. Rotoscoping is an animation technique that animators use to trace over motion picture footage frame by frame to produce realistic action. This technique substantially enhances the dreamlike quality of the film, which again was a choice by Linklater. An unintended benefit of using this experimental technique is that almost 20 years later, Waking Life enjoys a timeless quality. The film doesn't feel dated or less relevant now because of old production values. This way of telling a story makes the audience have to spend time with the ideas presented. The film challenges the audience to think about its fundamental questions. The film asks more questions than it provides answers. The idea of provoking the audience's internal inquisition is a part of the story.
There is no difference between dreaming a perception and an action, and actually the waking perception and action.
The culmination of so many experimental ideas has made Waking Life as relevant today as it ever was, both in terms of style and content. Linklater himself would later go on to produce A Scanner Darkly in 2006, a film adaptation of a Philip K. Dick novel, using a similar visual style to mild commercial success, and many other commercially successful films have been heavily influenced by Waking Life. Big budget blockbusters like Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse use rotoscoping techniques that seem to nod heavily towards the style of Linklater's work, and dreamlike narrative structures are littered throughout films like Inception. While these techniques have become more commonplace, it's likely that these ideas wouldn't exist in commercial film without artists like Linklater making a point to be different 20 years ago. Commercial cinema has evolved to be a very influential and lucrative industry. With billions of dollars on the line, contracts, studio obligations, and corporate sponsorships, there's a lot of pressure on filmmakers in the commercial world to please others before they please their own creative desire. Creativity has to be compromised for productivity and profit margin. That's not to say that there is no creativity in the commercial world. In fact, Martin Scorsese says in his article, "Many franchise films are made by people of considerable talent and artistry. You can see it on the screen." But he then goes on to say, "For me, for the filmmakers I came to love and respect, for the friends who started making movies around the same time I did, cinema was about revelation. Aesthetic, emotional, and spiritual revelation. Without revelation, it's hard to challenge the audience. It's hard to influence them to think critically and inspire them to want to create art that speaks to who they are, not what's the most valuable financially." Experimental cinema plays a vital role in the artistic side of filmmaking. It creates some of the most timeless and inspiring works for future artists, represents stories and ideas that are generally shied away from in mainstream cinema, opens up new avenues of narrative exploration, and the ideas presented can stay with the audience permanently. Contemporary experimental filmmaking is vital to propel cinema forwards as an art form, or in 20 years, there might not be anything as influential on future generations as Waking Life.
See, most people never ask themselves that when they're awake, or especially when they're asleep. Seems like everyone's sleepwalking through their waking state or wake-walking through their dreams.
I gotta go, man.
Okay, later, man. Super profundo on the early eve of your day.